In an age before the internet, scrolling and smartphones, this was how thousands across Wearside first learned of perhaps the worst crime ever committed on northeast soil. Shy little Nikki, murdered. A 4-word front page that summed up the horror and the loss.
I've got no little ones myself, but I've got grandkids that play in the garths. I just wish they'd let him in the garth and let everybody go at him.
There's supposed to be in a car knocking about or something. It's a shame when you kind of put your kids out in the street.
Now it's happening on your own front doorstep, so it's not safe anywhere.
Everybody knew them well.
What's the feeling on the estate today?
Everybody's devastated.
Nikki's tiny body had been found in the derelict old Exchange building close to the Weir Garth flats where she disappeared from the previous night. The pain, harder to bear for one mother more than any other.
I'm Sharon Henderson and I'm Nikki Allen's mum. Nikki was a mummy's girl, she was. When she was at school, she still had her dummy. She had a beautiful smile.
It was 9:30 at night when Nikki's mother told her to head down a flight of stairs back home from her grandparents' flat. But Nikki wandered off. At the Boar's Head across the road from the flats, it was another night of dominoes and a few drinks. Someone saw Nikki in the street. Witnesses said someone was with her, a man in a white shirt. Someone else saw them both. It looked, they said, like she knew him. She was skipping along to catch him up. She was skipping, as it turned out, to her own murder. This grainy footage, the last image of Nikki alive, a smaller figure following the footsteps of her killer. Police timed the walk from the Boar's Head opposite the Garths to the spot where Nikki's body was found at less than 5 minutes. Less than 5 minutes that would end here at the old Exchange in almost unimaginable horror. Nikki was hit, hurt and bundled through a boarded up back window. Inside, worse, her head beaten with a brick, stabbed more than 30 times and dragged dead down into the far corner of the basement and left. After hundreds had searched all night, Nikki's red shoes and purple coat were recovered outside the old Exchange. A short time later, a young teenager ran hysterically from the building after going in and finding Nikki's body. This footage from that morning shows Nikki's grandfather as he left the police station. He was supposed to be there for a press conference appealing for Nikki's safe return. Instead, he returned home to try somehow to counsel his own daughter and his family through the news few could bear to break to her.
I just felt no. All these people around us. And I was just thinking, where's Nikki?
This was news journalists at the time found hard to report.
My name's Danny Garavelli. In 1992, I was a crime reporter on the Newcastle Journal. I followed Nikki's case then, and I've kept in touch with it ever since. For many, many reasons, this was particularly shocking and something that stayed with me for my whole life because of that. I think it was partly the sheer brutality of it, and then there was all the pictures of Nikki, which were, she was such a smiley little girl that was so obviously loved. And then there was the whole feeling that the community was affected, the impact on Sharon, obviously, but beyond that, the effect on the whole community. The whole community was really, really plunged into darkness.
A funeral followed, what felt like the whole of the East End of Sunderland joining a 20-car cortege to the church. Trying to lead a whole community through its grief, a young vicar now living back in Dublin.
I'm Canon Mark Gardner. and I was for some years vicar in Sunderland parish, and I officiated at the funeral of Nikki Allen. I remember the crowd, I remember the funeral procession, quite a long one. Everybody was aghast, because that wasn't the sort of thing that you would have expected among people who knew each other and looked after each other. There could be tough people, but fair. I remember hearing the undertakers talking to each other, and even they were shocked and horrified. Actually, I wish I hadn't heard what they said to each other. Details I didn't want to know.
Sharon was held up through most of the service and the burial that followed. Her memories of that day, difficult to retell.
I can remember beads in the church, Father Mark, and then the cemetery. Didn't want to screaming, not to near Nikki's grave.
But after the burial, there was still a search for Nikki's killer to conclude. This artist's impression of the man seen with Nikki, a centrepiece of the inquiry. In those early days, scores of officers were working on the case. Paper files on the walls, a clue to the low-tech nature of 90s policing. But the handling of the man who was initially their prime suspect would become infamous as a low point in police work. George Heron, who lived in the area Nikki called home, was charged with her murder and brought to trial in Leeds in 1993. But he was cleared after a confession he'd made to detectives was ruled inadmissible by a judge. People who heard the transcripts of those interviews would come to see them as both unprofessional and unforgivable.
So in those interviews, George Heron had denied killing Nikki more than 120 times. But then under the pressure that was brought to bear on him, he gradually began to make admissions of sorts. But I think what I found particularly shocking was the way in which they then led him to give an account of what had happened there that matched what they needed to hear. In other words, what they knew had happened, by dropping clues and just basically manipulating him to describe it in the way that they knew. I mean, there were quite clearly things that he didn't know, and they led him to it.
And so began more than 20 years where Sharon would be left fighting for justice for Nikki. Then in 2017, after another appeal from Nikki's mother, police decided to use advanced DNA techniques to try and discover who was Nikki's killer. Microscopic traces led them finally to this man, David Boyd. Of hundreds of men from the Guards and a wider area tested his profile, the only one that matched the DNA on Nikki's clothing. At his trial, it emerged Boyd had told house-to-house detectives just days after the killing that he knew Nikki, that he'd seen her that night, that he'd been in the old Exchange building a few days earlier with a young boy looking for pigeons. He also had a prior conviction for a sexual offence against a child.
I'm Jen Jarvie. I'm a private investigator and lecturer in professional policing, and I have reviewed the Nikki Allen case. The police have a difficult job. They have a difficult job to do, and, particularly with a child murder. However, in this particular case, they failed Sharon. They failed Nikki, monumentally to begin with, but then continue to do that for a lot of years. They had an ideal suspect there, and they failed to pinpoint him time and time again.
What made the difference in the end?
The difference, which is usually the case in most cold cases, is the fact that they were able to progress forensics and DNA, and were able to actually pinpoint DNA on Nikki's body that belonged categorically to David Boyd.
I've been through so much mental health hospitals, getting arrested all the time, just for looking for the killer. No, but nobody was listening.
She has kept going, and I don't believe David Boyd would have been in the dock without Sharon, really.
David? Yeah, how are you doing? I fixed it there. No.
And this was the moment justice finally caught up with David Boyd. His reaction on his arrest, cool, seemingly unsurprised, perhaps like he'd been expecting a knock at the door for years. What's the right punishment for Boyd?
I wouldn't like to see her on camera, but it would have to come from me. Definitely would have to come from me.
Sharon, do you talk to Nikki?
All the time. All the time.
And what do you tell her?
I keep saying I'm sorry because I let you go down the flight of stairs. And I promise I'll never give up. And I just sometimes sit and cry.
David Boyd never spoke at his trial, leaving some questions still unanswered. But he will now finally answer for Nikki's murder, 31 years after he did it.